Every single day your mind takes damage. Not the kind that makes headlines, not the kind that stops your life immediately, but small invisible damage that quietly accumulates. Stress leaves marks. Worry creates cracks. Fear chips away at your confidence. Disappointment slowly wears down your sense of control. None of it looks dramatic in the moment, which is exactly why most people ignore it. They wake up tired and call it normal. They feel mentally drained and assume that's just part of being an adult. They carry tension in their chest, restlessness in their thoughts, and exhaustion in their decisions. Yet they never stop to ask a simple question: what is this doing to my mind? Over time, most people treat the mind like a machine that should run endlessly without maintenance. Wake up, push through the day, absorb whatever life throws at you, then repeat the same process tomorrow. But the mind doesn't work like a machine. It works more like a structure you live inside, a house, if you will. And every single day that house takes damage. A harsh conversation scratches the walls. A stressful situation shakes the foundation. Doubt creeps in like a small crack forming where you barely notice it. Over time, those tiny cracks spread. They widen slowly, silently, until one day the structure no longer feels stable. You wake up feeling heavy for no clear reason. You lose patience more easily. Small problems feel overwhelming. What you call just being tired is often something deeper, accumulated inner damage that was never repaired. The ancient Stoics understood this reality with brutal clarity. These were not philosophers protected from hardship. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire during war and plague. Epictetus lived as a slave before becoming one of history's greatest teachers of resilience. Seneca experienced political power, exile, and betrayal. None of them believed life would spare you from pressure. Instead, they believed something far more important. Damage is inevitable. Neglect is optional. They knew that if you do not consciously repair your mind, the weight of ordinary life will slowly erode it. Not in one catastrophic moment, but in thousands of tiny moments that gradually reshape the way you think, react, and see yourself. So the real question is not whether your mind takes damage. It does. The real question is whether you repair it before the damage becomes who you are. Most people never repair their minds, not because they are lazy or incapable, but because the world quietly trains them not to. From a young age, we are taught to keep moving, keep producing, keep performing. If you are tired, push through it. If you are stressed, work harder. If you are struggling internally, hide it and stay functional. The modern world rewards output, not inner repair. So people learn to measure themselves by how well they keep going. As long as they show up to work, answer messages, pay bills, and handle responsibilities, they assume everything is fine. On the outside, they are functioning. But functioning and being well are not the same thing. A person can be productive and still be mentally exhausted. They can be successful and still feel internally unstable. They can appear strong while quietly carrying unresolved damage. This is where one of the most dangerous misunderstandings begins. Many people start confusing endurance with health. They believe that if they can keep moving forward, then nothing inside them needs attention. But endurance without repair slowly turns into erosion. Every unresolved worry stays in the mind. Every ignored frustration builds pressure. Every disappointment that is never processed becomes another small crack in the structure of their thinking. Over time, something else happens. The damage becomes familiar. Instead of recognizing stress, people normalize it. Instead of addressing emotional exhaustion, they call it adulthood. Instead of repairing the mind, they simply learn to live with the damage. In fact, modern culture often praises this behavior. Someone who suppresses their emotions, works constantly, and never complains is often described as strong. But the Stoics understood something most people miss. Emotional numbness is not strength. It is often a sign that the mind has stopped processing what it cannot handle. True strength is not pretending nothing affects you. True strength is maintaining awareness of what is happening inside you and responding to it with discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, not because he lacked control, but because he understood that reflection was a form of maintenance. Seneca reviewed his thoughts daily for the same reason a craftsman inspects his tools. Without that awareness, damage accumulates silently. You carry yesterday's stress into today, today's frustration into tomorrow. Weeks turn into months, and months turn into years. Eventually, what began as small mental strain becomes a permanent way of thinking. That is why the Stoics insisted on something radical for their time, and still radical today. Before you try to conquer the day, repair the mind that must face it. The first repairs begin with something simple, but surprisingly powerful: clearing what should not enter today. Most people wake up already carrying weight that doesn't belong to the new day. Before their feet even touch the floor, their mind replays yesterday's argument, yesterday's mistake, yesterday's embarrassment, or yesterday's worry. Psychologists call this mental carryover, the habit of dragging unfinished emotional residue from one day into the next. The Stoics saw it long before modern psychology gave it a name. Seneca warned that people suffer more from imagination and memory than from reality itself. In other words, we don't just experience problems once we relive them repeatedly. This is the first repair: throw out yesterday's trash. Just like you wouldn't carry a bag of garbage from your kitchen into a new day, you shouldn't carry old mental debris either. Take a moment in the morning and deliberately release it. Acknowledge what happened, learn from it if necessary, then mentally discard it. Yesterday's problems have no authority over today unless you give them space in your mind. Once the trash is cleared, the next repair is checking your foundation. Many people start their mornings by piling responsibilities onto themselves before they even assess their capacity. Emails, obligations, deadlines, expectations, it all stacks up quickly. But no builder begins construction without first checking the ground beneath the structure. Your mental state works the same way. Some mornings your foundation is strong, you're rested, focused, and capable of carrying a heavy load. Other mornings the foundation is weaker. Maybe you slept poorly, maybe stress is lingering, maybe your attention feels scattered. Ignoring that reality leads people to overload themselves and then blame themselves when they collapse halfway through the day. A wiser approach is honest assessment. Ask yourself, what can I realistically carry today? Not what would impress others, not what you wish you could handle, but what your current foundation can actually support. The third repair is fixing small cracks before they spread. A tiny worry left unresolved begins to occupy space in your attention. It sits quietly in the background of your thoughts, draining focus. Psychologists often call these attention leaks unresolved problems that quietly consume mental energy. Marcus Aurelius compared this to cracks in a wall. When a crack first appears, it takes seconds to seal. Ignore it, and water enters, pressure spreads, and eventually the entire structure weakens. The same happens in the mind. A small avoided conversation becomes lingering anxiety. A delayed decision becomes constant doubt. Addressing these small issues early prevents them from expanding into something much harder to repair later. Another essential repair is removing what weakens you from the inside. Many people try to strengthen their minds while still holding on to the very things that are draining them. They meditate, read books, watch motivational videos, and promise themselves they will become mentally stronger. Yet they continue surrounding themselves with habits, environments, and relationships that slowly poison their thinking. The Stoics were very direct about this. Seneca wrote that anything you cannot walk away from eventually becomes your master. In other words, if something consistently harms your peace but you keep it in your life, out of fear, habit, or comfort, it gains power over you. That influence might not look dramatic at first. Sometimes it appears in the form of a friendship that constantly leaves you feeling smaller, a job that quietly drains your sense of purpose, or a habit that numbs you rather than strengthens you. Each exposure adds a small amount of poison to the mind. Most people tolerate this because removing it feels uncomfortable. Familiar pain often feels safer than uncertain change. But the longer you keep something toxic in your environment, the more it shapes how you see yourself. Slowly, it begins to redefine your identity. You start accepting situations you once believed you would never tolerate. That is the hidden cost of compromise. This leads to the next repair, deciding what you simply will not break. Every strong structure has load-bearing walls, the parts of the building that hold everything together. In life, those walls are your non-negotiable principles. They might be honesty, self-respect, discipline, or personal boundaries. When those principles remain solid, the rest of your life stays stable. But when you repeatedly compromise them, the structure weakens. At first, it seems like a small exception, then another. Eventually, you no longer recognize the standards you once believed in. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that a person's character is revealed not by what they claim to value, but by what they refuse to betray. Deciding what you will not break protects the integrity of who you are. The final repair in this group is learning to release pressure before it builds into something destructive. Many people confuse emotional suppression with strength. They believe discipline means ignoring what they feel. But Stoicism never taught emotional numbness. It taught awareness and control. Suppressed emotion does not disappear. It accumulates. Every unspoken truth, every unresolved frustration, every fear you refuse to acknowledge becomes internal pressure. Over time, that pressure looks like irritability, burnout, or sudden emotional explosions that seem out of proportion to the situation. The Stoics understood that honesty with yourself is a form of relief. Writing reflection or speaking difficult truths allows the pressure to escape gradually instead of bursting all at once. When you remove poison, protect your principles, and release pressure regularly, the mind becomes lighter, clearer, and far more resilient. Preparing the mind before the world touches it is one of the most overlooked forms of mental strength. Most people begin their day by immediately reacting to whatever appears in front of them. An alarm rings, a phone lights up, and within seconds the mind is flooded with emails, messages, news alerts, and social media updates. Before they have even taken a full breath, the outside world has already taken control of their attention. The Stoics believed this was a dangerous way to start a day because the mind becomes reactive instead of deliberate. One of their most powerful practices was called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of difficulties. Instead of assuming everything would go smoothly, they would briefly imagine what could go wrong. A meeting might fail, a plan might fall apart, someone might disappoint them. This was not pessimism, it was preparation. When you mentally rehearse possible challenges, you remove the shock if they actually happen. Anticipation replaces panic. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond calmly because you have already considered the situation. Even spending 30 seconds imagining a potential obstacle and deciding how you would handle it can dramatically reduce stress later in the day. Equally important is protecting the first part of your morning. The first 30 minutes after waking up are when your mind is most impressionable. Neuroscience shows that during this period, your brain is shifting from sleep rhythms into full awareness, making it highly sensitive to whatever information enters first. If the first input is chaos, breaking news, angry headlines, endless notifications, your nervous system immediately shifts into stress mode. But if the first input is calm and intentional, the brain stabilizes before the demands of the day begin. This is especially important in the modern dopamine environment we live in. Phones, apps, and social platforms are designed to capture attention instantly. They trigger small bursts of stimulation that make it easy to scroll without thinking. The problem is that constant stimulation fragments your focus before the day even starts. Instead of directing your thoughts, you begin the day consuming other people's priorities. That is why the Stoics were extremely careful about what they allowed into their minds. Marcus Aurelius often began his mornings reflecting on principles that strengthened his thinking before facing the chaos of leadership. The idea is simple but powerful. Your mental diet shapes your emotional posture. If you feed your mind clarity, wisdom, and purposeful thought, your thinking becomes structured and steady. If you feed it noise, outrage, and distraction, your thinking becomes scattered and reactive. Preparing your mind before the world touches it ensures that you begin the day grounded in your own direction rather than pulled by external chaos. Rebuilding strength on purpose is where Stoic discipline becomes truly practical. Most people wait for life to test them. They assume strength will somehow appear in the moment they need it. But the Stoics believed something very different. If you never train your mind under controlled difficulty, you cannot expect it to remain steady when real difficulty arrives. This is why they practiced voluntary discomfort. It wasn't about suffering for the sake of suffering. It was about teaching the mind that hardship is survivable. When you deliberately choose a harder option, waking up early when you want to sleep in, exercising when you feel lazy, finishing a difficult task, instead of avoiding it, you are sending a signal to yourself, I can handle this. Each small challenge becomes a form of self-trust training. Over time, that trust compounds. The next obstacle feels less threatening because you have already proven to yourself that discomfort does not equal danger. Another part of this repair is daily mental maintenance. Just as a skilled mechanic checks a machine before it fails, the Stoics believed the mind should be examined regularly. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal almost every morning and evening, not to impress anyone but to repair his thinking. Journaling for him was not a performance or a productivity trick. It was a way to observe his own thoughts, question them, and adjust them before they hardened into harmful patterns. When you pause to reflect, you begin to notice small signals you might otherwise ignore. A lingering frustration, a creeping doubt, a pattern of negative thinking that quietly repeats itself. Catching these signals early allows you to correct them while they are still manageable. Without that awareness, those patterns grow stronger until they feel like permanent parts of your personality. Finally, there is the repair most people overlook entirely: building something that lasts. Much of modern life revolves around temporary tasks. Emails are answered, notifications are cleared, problems are solved, and by the end of the day, almost nothing remains. You spent energy, but you created nothing meaningful. This is one reason many people feel exhausted yet strangely unfulfilled. The Stoics approached life differently. They believed that every day should contain at least one act of creation, something that compounds over time. Writing a page, learning a skill, teaching someone else, building knowledge, strengthening character. These actions accumulate into something durable. In a world that constantly pushes us toward shallow distraction, creating something lasting becomes a powerful act of resistance. It reminds you that your effort is not just maintaining survival, but shaping a life with depth and meaning. What begins to emerge from all these ideas is something deeper than a list of tips. The Stoics were not simply offering scattered pieces of advice about discipline, productivity, or emotional control. They were describing a system, a way of maintaining the mind before asking it to perform. Most people today live in the opposite order. They wake up and immediately demand output from themselves. Be productive, be focused, be strong, handle pressure, solve problems, stay calm, make good decisions, and they expect their mind to deliver all of that instantly without preparation. When the mind struggles under that weight, they assume something is wrong with them. But often nothing is wrong with the person. The system is wrong. Stoicism teaches maintenance before ambition. Before you try to conquer the day, stabilize the mind that will face it. Before you demand strength, create the conditions that allow strength to exist. Just like an athlete warms up before competition, the Stoics believed the mind must be prepared before it enters the chaos of the world. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Each morning he reminded himself what kind of people he might encounter: arrogance, selfishness, impatience, dishonesty. Not because he enjoyed negative thinking, but because he knew preparation removed emotional shock. When those behaviors appeared later in the day, he was not surprised or destabilized. His mind had already rehearsed its response. This is the rhythm Stoicism encourages. Repair, prepare, then perform. Repair means clearing yesterday's emotional debris, releasing pressure, and removing what weakens you. Prepare means protecting your attention, feeding your mind quality ideas, and anticipating potential challenges. Only after those steps comes performance. The work, the responsibilities, the decisions that shape your day. Without this rhythm, people operate in constant reaction mode. Their thoughts are pulled in every direction by stress, distraction, and emotional impulses. But when repair and preparation happen first, the mind enters the day grounded. Problems still appear. Difficult people still exist. Unexpected setbacks still happen. Stoicism never promised a life without difficulty. What it promised was stability within difficulty. Mental resilience is not built through occasional bursts of motivation. It is built through rhythm. Small repairs repeated every morning. Quiet adjustments made before damage accumulates. The strength that emerges from that rhythm is subtle but powerful. Instead of forcing yourself to be strong in the middle of chaos, you become someone whose mind was prepared long before the chaos arrived. What all of this leads to is a simple but powerful realization. Taking damage does not make you weak. It makes you human. Every person who is alive and engaged with life will experience stress, disappointment, fear, and uncertainty. No philosophy, no mindset, and no amount of discipline can completely prevent that. The Stoics never claimed otherwise. They did not promise a life without pressure. What they offered was something far more realistic and far more powerful: the ability to repair yourself before the damage becomes permanent. The real danger is not that life wears you down from time to time. The real danger is when the damage is ignored long enough that it quietly reshapes who you believe you are. A few bad experiences become a negative mindset. A few failures become a story about personal inadequacy. A period of stress slowly becomes a permanent sense of exhaustion. When repairs never happen, temporary damage hardens into identity. This is why the Stoics placed so much importance on daily reflection and morning preparation. They understood that every morning offers a small window of control before the outside world begins making demands. In that quiet space, you have the chance to reset your thinking. You can let go of what does not belong to today. You can remind yourself of your principles. You can strengthen your focus before stress and distraction try to weaken it again. Each small repair may seem insignificant in the moment. Throwing out yesterday's mental trash, protecting your attention, choosing discipline instead of comfort, writing down your thoughts, removing something toxic from your environment. None of these actions feel dramatic, but repeated every day, they create something powerful. Repair becomes habit. Habit becomes character. And character quietly shapes the direction of your life. This is the deeper Stoic insight. Identity is not formed through grand declarations about who you want to be. It is formed through small daily choices about how you maintain your mind. Every time you repair your thinking, instead of ignoring the damage, you reinforce a different version of yourself, a version that refuses to collapse under pressure. So the next time life leaves a mark on your mind, and it will remember that the mark itself is not the problem. The only real question is what you do afterward. Because every morning gives you the same opportunity: repair what was damaged, strengthen what was weakened, and step back into the world with a mind that is ready to stand again.